The trade deadline is upon us, and as NBA fans, this is one of the most exciting points of the season. It's the anticipation for any of those trade rumors that have been floating around social media to come to fruition. Some teams will look to fill small holes in the roster, like adding a rim protector or a three-point shooter as they ramp up for the postseason. Other teams will go a different direction, as they enter or continue their rebuilding process while they browse for young talent and picks. And in some cases, an all-star caliber player will be dealt to a new team, creating the biggest headline from that year's trade deadline. That being said, every year doesn't guarantee a big name to be moved, but when it does happen, the buzz in the NBA world is at an all-time high. So today, as we wait for this year's trades to ramp up, I thought it would be fun to take a look back at the biggest names to be moved at deadline in the last 10 years. And before we get onto the list, in the comments, I want y'all to let me know which trades you're hoping to see before this year's deadline. Starting out, the first trade I wanted to look at doesn't quite involve an all-star player, but it was a unique story of a former #1 overall pick. February 7th, 2019, hours before the trade deadline, it was announced that Philly's 2017 first overall pick, Markelle Fultz, was traded to the Orlando Magic for Jonathan Simmons and some future picks. Now typically, we see a rookie last longer than a season and a half on the team that they're drafted to, especially when it comes to the first overall pick. But as most of us know, Fultz had one of the most unique health complications we've seen in NBA history. Only playing in his first 4 games after being drafted, it was announced that the 76ers point guard would miss some time due to a shoulder injury. Later on, we found out it was much deeper than that, as it was reported that Fultz had the yips. The yips is essentially a condition where an athlete can forget how to perform basic physical maneuvers. In this case, Markelle forgot how to shoot the ball. He had developed multiple hitches in his jump shot, and had to work from the ground up, redeveloping his jumper. Obviously, from his time in college, Fultz was looked at as an athletic guard who could very well score the ball, coming into the league with a decent jump shot. Then, after only 33 games played in 1.5 seasons with the Sixers, Fultz was traded mid-season to the Orlando Magic for Jonathan Simmons. Markelle would sit the remainder of that year and come into the 2019-2020 season healthy, as he played in 72 games. Since the trade, we've seen Fultz average 12 points, 5 assists, and 1 steal per game. Most importantly, it's clear that Fultz has made amazing progress in working through the hitches in his jumper. But unfortunately, this year in the 2020-2021 season, we only saw Markelle play in 8 games before tearing his ACL against the Cavs. A devastating injury for the young guard, and I think the entire NBA community is rooting for him to make the full recovery. But that wasn't the only deal the 76ers made at the 2019 deadline. The night before the Fultz trade, February 6, 2019, the 76ers had traded Wilson Chandler, Mike Muscala, Landry Shamet, and a couple first-round picks for Tobias Harris, Boban Marjanovic, and Mike Scott. Adding Tobias Harris to the roster assembled what many looked at as a big four, where he'd be playing next to Embiid, Simmons, and Jimmy Butler. Philly gave up a lot for Harris, but in their defense, Tobias was putting up career numbers for the Clippers, averaging 20 points and 7 rebounds per game. So now with another shot creator added to the roster, Philly finished the regular season as the 3rd seed in the East and ready to make a deep run in the playoffs. After beating the Nets in 5 games in the first round, the 76ers moved on to play the 2nd seed Toronto Raptors. It was a close series that came down to a Game 7, and with the game tied with 4.2 seconds left, Philly hoped to continue their quest for a championship by sending the game into overtime. But Kawhi Leonard had different plans.
Gotta be aware of the inbounder here if you're Philly.
It's off to Leonard, defended by Simmons. Is this the dagger?
All in all, a devastating ending to a season where Philly had a real chance at making it to the finals, given their loaded roster. That offseason, Jimmy Butler was traded to his preferred destination in Miami, and the big three of Harris, Simmons, and Embiid remains in Philly, where they are still a top contender in the East. Though the trade seemed to work out well for the Sixers, as Tobias is averaging a career-high 21 points and 7.5 rebounds this season, the what-ifs of the 2019 playoffs will always be a discussion had Kawhi Leonard missed this game winner. The next trade on the list was actually a series of trades made by the Cavaliers in 2018, what many view as one of the wildest trade deadlines ever for a single team. After a lackluster first half of the season, Cavs GM Kobe Altman did his best to structure a new contending roster around LeBron James. On the day of the deadline, February 8, 2018, the first trade was announced. The Cavaliers were sending former All-Star Isaiah Thomas and Channing Frye to the Lakers for Jordan Clarkson and Larry Nance Jr. Then, there was a second trade involving 3 teams. Cleveland would ship out Derrick Rose, Jay Crowder, and Iman Shumpert for George Hill and Rodney Hood. The third trade was a gesture of respect to the future Hall of Famer Dwayne Wade, who they traded back to Miami for a 2nd-round pick. It was clear that the goal of Kobe Altman was to make the Cavs younger and faster, and apparently the new dynamic of the roster worked, as the Cavs went from 31-22 before the deadline and finished the season 50-32, earning them the 4th seed in the East. Not only that, but LeBron and the new look Cavs made it all the way to the NBA Finals where they would face the Warriors, and we all know how unfair that matchup was. Though the trades resulted in a finals appearance, it wouldn't be enough to keep LeBron in Cleveland. That offseason, he took his talents to the Los Angeles Lakers in free agency. Our next big deadline trade took place back in 2012, but don't worry, it played a big part in building a recent dynasty. 48 hours ahead of the 2012 March 15th trade deadline, the Golden State Warriors and Milwaukee Bucks agreed to a 5-player trade involving Monte Ellis and Andrew Bogut. Though he was never an all-star, Ellis averaged about 21 points per game in his 7.5 seasons with the Warriors, who they exchanged for an at the time injured center, Andrew Bogut. The craziest part about this trade is that Golden State had initially offered Steph Curry instead of Monte Ellis, but the Bucks declined because they were worried about Curry's ankle health, something he had issues with early on in his career. At that point, we know how the story goes. The then guard combo of Ellis and Curry would transform into Curry and Clay, also known as the Splash Brothers. Though Bogut would never regain the scoring ability he had prior to his knee injury, he was able to alter his game to complement the shooting backcourt, setting some of the best screens in the NBA to go along with his underrated passing ability. Monte would continue his scoring on the Bucks, helping them reach the playoffs in his second season on the team. But something tells me if Milwaukee could go back and take the initial offer of Steph Curry, they would. Up next, we have a recent trade involving a player that could play a huge part in this year's deadline. February 6, 2020, it was announced that Pistons two-time All-Star center Andre Drummond was traded to the Cleveland Cavaliers in exchange for Brandon Knight, John Henson, and his second-round pick. After being such a productive player for his time in Detroit, with averages of 14 points, 14 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks per game, it was shocking to see the Pistons get back next to nothing for the former All-Star. Drummond had a player option in the 2020-2021 season worth nearly $29 million, and apparently the Pistons were willing to take anything instead of paying him. That being said, Drummond played in just 8 games for the Cavs that season, and has played in only 25 this season before sitting out while they figure out possible trade or, more than likely, a buyout agreement. Should they reach that buyout agreement, it's reported that he'll likely sign with a contending team for the remainder of the season. Possibly the Nets or the Lakers, where he'll make a big impact in their quest for their championship. 2020 had an eventful deadline. That same year, 2 more big names were moved. Once again on February 6th, it was announced that the Golden State Warriors were trading former All-Star D'Angelo Russell to the Minnesota Timberwolves for Andrew Wiggins, a 2021 first-round pick, and a 2022 second-round pick. The Warriors made this trade in preparation for the return of Klay Thompson coming off his ACL injury, where Wiggins can play in the third option next to the Splash Brothers. But unfortunately, as we all know, Klay tore his Achilles before the season started, so we're still waiting to see the dynamic of their full roster. This being his first full season on the Warriors, Wiggins is averaging 17 points per game while shooting a career high from the field and from 3. The former first overall pick hasn't quite lived up to the expectations he had entering the league, but acquiring both him and a 2021 first round pick, it's safe to say that the Warriors made a great return for Russell. Speaking of D'Lo, he's only played in 21 games for the Timberwolves due to injuries, most recently requiring knee surgery in February that listed him out for 4 to 6 weeks. But a young big 3 of Russell, Cat, and Anthony Edwards sounds like a nice foundation moving forward should he get back to his all-star form. Our next big name to be moved took place a week prior to the February 7th, 2019 trade deadline. On January 31st, it was announced that the New York Knicks were trading Kristaps Porzingis, Courtney Lee, and Tim Hardaway Jr. to the Dallas Mavericks for Dennis Smith Jr., Wesley Matthews, and DeAndre Jordan. Kristaps Porzingis was New York's 4th overall pick in 2015 and quickly made a name for himself as one of the best bigs in the league. During his 3rd season for the Knicks, Porzingis suffered a torn ACL that had him miss the entire 2018-2019 season. It was during that time that reports started coming out that Kristaps wasn't happy on the Knicks and wanted to be moved to another team. Leading up to the deadline, he made it clear to the front office that he would not be re-signing with them. Knicks president Steve Mills recalls the request.
And point blank said to us, I don't want to be here. I'm not going to resign with the Knicks. And I'm going to give you 7 days to trade me, or I'm going back to Europe. You know?
Threatening to go back to Europe if not traded sounds pretty extreme and shows exactly how unhappy Kristaps was playing for the struggling franchise. Ultimately, the trade turned out great for the Mavericks. They were able to pair their young franchise superstar Luka Doncic with a proven big man for the future. The only concern if he can stay healthy long term. The Knicks, on the other hand, many look to be the losers of the trade. They've since moved on from the young point guard Dennis Smith Jr., who hasn't quite turned out to be the exciting player many expected him to be. That being said, the Knicks are now in the playoff hunt in the East, and have since mostly recovered from the departure of Porzingis. Our next trade is one I highlighted a bit in my previous video. It took place a week prior to the 2018 trade deadline. On January 29th, it was announced that the Clippers had traded Blake Griffin to the Detroit Pistons for Tobias Harris, Avery Bradley, Boban Marjanovic and a draft pick. This trade came as a shock to the NBA community due to the fact that Griffin had just signed a 5-year max contract extension with the Clippers just 6 months prior. This was the big move that officially ended the Lob City days in LA. The Clippers obviously have made more changes since then, now with new faces of their franchise, Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. As for the Pistons, Blake's first full season was promising as he led them to the 8th seed in the playoffs. But unfortunately, the story of Blake's career, injuries caught up to him as he required back-to-back knee surgeries while playing for his new team. Since then, Blake had only played in a handful of games for the Pistons, and it appears now he's just a shell of his former self. Griffin and the Pistons recently reached a buyout agreement, which led him to sign a deal with the Brooklyn Nets for the remainder of the season in hopes of winning a title. Though it was heartless, I'm sure Steve Ballmer feels like he made the right move for the future of his franchise. Now it's time to rewind back to the 2011 trade deadline. Coming off a historically bad season with a record of 12-70, the New Jersey Nets were desperate to bring new life to their franchise. So on February 23, 2011, the shocking deal was announced. New Jersey was sending former 2009 All-Star Devin Harris, 2010 third overall pick Derek Favors, and 2 first-round draft picks to Utah for Deron Williams. This deal came as a surprise because at the time, Deron Williams was seen as the best point guard in the league in the conversation with Chris Paul. But unfortunately, 2 weeks prior to the deadline, Williams and Jazz head coach Jerry Sloan had a falling out which ultimately led to Sloan resigning. NBA fans began to look at Deron as a coach killer, which is why many believe Utah was willing to let go of their franchise point guard. After the deal was done, Williams came into New Jersey as advertised, averaging nearly 13 assists in 12 games played for the Nets. Due to a nagging wrist injury, New Jersey wisely sat Deron the remaining of the year to come into next season healthy. Fast forwarding a bit, the Nets moved to Brooklyn in 2012 when they signed Deron to a 5-year extension, and also brought in All-Star Joe Johnson to form a big three with Brook Lopez. After making the playoffs for the first time since 2007 and 2013, Brooklyn felt they were just a couple pieces away from becoming a true contender in the East. So in the offseason before the 2013-2014 season, Brooklyn made the famous trade to acquire future Hall of Famers Paul Pierce and Kevin Garnett, in exchange for Jared Wallace, some role players, and most importantly first-round picks in 2014, 2016, 2018, and the rights to swap in 2017. They had mortgaged their entire future in hopes that Deron could lead them to a championship with now an experienced roster. But that season, Williams' numbers were disappointing as he battled with ankle injuries, averaging just 14 points and 6 assists per game. On top of that, the Nets ended the season with a record of 44-38, which was 5 wins less than the year prior. Going into the playoffs as a 6th seed, the Nets made it past the first round after a 7-game series against the Raptors. Next, they faced the Miami Heat, where they were knocked out in just 5 games, the team that they were ultimately assembled to compete with. After their disappointing season, the Nets didn't re-sign Pierce, they traded Garnett for Thaddeus Young, and before the 2015-2016 season, Brooklyn and Deron agreed to a buyout for the remaining 2 years of his contract, officially ending his days of being the face of a franchise. Up next, we have another All-Star who was traded at an unexpected time. During the 2017 All-Star Game, Sacramento Kings center DeMarcus Cousins was traded to the New Orleans Pelicans for Buddy Hield, Tyreek Evans, and Langston Galloway. Cousins didn't find out until the post-game interview, where you can actually see him being whispered the news. In 2020, DeMarcus Cousins went on the All Smoke podcast, where he recalls the trade.
I mean, so crazy thing is, at that game, for that All-Star game, my locker was right next to Russ. And Russ just kind of hollered at me like, you know what I'm saying? I'm hearing some things. What's up with? And I'm just like, bro, like that's not gonna happen. Like, so obviously he knew something I didn't.
Right.
So end of the game, dude kind of the interviewer, asked me a question, and I'm just like, you know what I'm saying? What you talking about? He kind of hollered. The PR guy from New Orleans at the time. No, I mean for SAC at the time. Such and such and such and such. Just like, damn, and I know I'm on camera.
Like, yeah, the world is looking at you.
Yeah, so I'm just like trying to play, I'm
right.
putting my poker face on. I'm like, oh, well, yeah, I love New Orleans. Yeah, but.
So that wasn't what you wanted?
No, not at all.
Though Cousins didn't request it, his short time on the Pelicans was special. DeMarcus was putting up 25 points, 11 rebounds, and 1.5 blocks per game, next to his star teammate Anthony Davis. The two had created one of the most unique big man duos we've ever seen. Both bigs can handle the ball and run the pick and roll together, shoot threes, and basically function as guards from the power forward and center position. The league's newest dynamic duo seemed to be on pace to make a deep run in the playoffs up until January 26, 2018, when Cousins suffered a torn Achilles in the final minutes of a game against Houston. From that point on, we haven't seen DeMarcus cover to the player he once was. After a season with the Warriors where he played in limited games, Boogie and AD were set for a reunion on the Lakers, up until he suffered a torn ACL before the season started. This year we saw Cousins play in 25 games for Houston when he averaged 9 points and 7 rebounds in 20 minutes, before they decided to part ways. Though his mobility won't ever be what it once was, Cousins can still provide floor spacing with his soft touch from 3, an asset playoff teams might consider for the second half of this season. The last big trade on the list is a throwback that took place 10 years ago. After months of speculation, a few days before the 2011 trade deadline, the historic blockbuster deal was announced. The Denver Nuggets were trading Carmelo Anthony and Chauncey Billups to the Knicks, in exchange for Wilson Chandler, Raymond Felton, Danilo Gallinari, Timofey Mozgov, and a 2014 first-round pick. There was also some other picks and players involved to fit the salary cap, but all in all, it was a trade that changed the dynamic for both rosters. After spending 8.5 seasons on the Nuggets, superstar Carmelo Anthony was now the face of the struggling New York franchise. He played for the Knicks from 2011 to 2017, and in those years, they only made the playoffs 3 times. On top of that, they only made it past the first round once, that being in 2013 when they lost to the Pacers in the second round. Carmelo's time in New York can be a bit of a controversial topic, as many looked at his isolation playstyle to be the reason for their lack of success. Though they never truly turned into the contender that the Knicks had hoped for, Melo still solidified himself as one of the best pure scorers of all time, while he averaged 25 points and 7 rebounds in New York. Carmelo has since moved on to a new role in the league, now averaging 14 points off the bench for the Portland Trail Blazers at the age of 36. Meanwhile, the Nuggets franchise has managed well since the blockbuster trade, making the playoffs 5 times since 2011 and have a new face repping number 15 for Denver. So there it is, some of the biggest names to be moved at trade deadline in the last 10 years. At the end of the day, the NBA is a business, and franchises will continue to make tough decisions for the best of their team. With the playoffs around the corner, it'll be interesting to see what players will be moved at this year's deadline, as contenders will go great lengths to achieve the ultimate season goal.